When people say America is on the verge of civil war, they're not stupid. They're reaching to something real. But the feeling they're responding to is not collapse, it's strain. And those two things lead to very different futures. Something feels off in the country. The tone is sharper, the arguments are louder, and the trust feels a lot thinner. Every election feels existential, and every crisis feels final. Every disagreement feels like proof that the system is breaking. So it becomes natural to ask the most extreme question. Is this what it feels like when countries fall apart? Or you could ask, is this what it feels like before governments collapse? And then the most obvious question is the United States headed toward a civil war? That question makes sense emotionally, but structurally, it points in the wrong direction. Now, it would be comforting to say everything is fine, but it would also be dishonest because people see empty storefronts, they see layoffs, they see political anger hardening instead of cooling down. So, this is not about pretending there's no instability. The real question is not whether there is tension. The question is what kind of tension this actually is. When most people imagine a civil war, they picture chaos. They picture street violence, armed groups or militias, flags, ideology clashing in public. But historically, civil wars don't begin with noise. They actually begin with silence. Silence from institutions, silence from enforcement, silence from legitimacy. Because civil war requires more than just anger. It requires the state to stop functioning as a whole. So, for a country to descend into a civil war, there's a couple things, or a few things actually, that have to happen all at the same time. So, first, a mass collapse of legitimacy. Not distrust, not frustration, but widespread refusal to recognize the state at all. Second, a organized parallel power, not protests, not isolated militias, an actual alternative authorities that can govern the territory, that collect resources, that command loyalty. And then third would be elite fracture, which would be the military, the police, the courts, and bureaucracy splitting into opposing camps. The fourth thing would be an economic shutdown. People can't get paid, food doesn't move, money stops working, and survival replaces politics. These conditions aren't small, but they are not mistakable. And the United States doesn't meet any of those requirements right now. Now, if we're being honest, America is deeply polarized. That much is actually true. We all know that. But polarization and ungovernability are not the same thing because people still vote, they still pay taxes, they still go to court, they still use banks, they still expect the system to function. They argue inside the system, not outside of it. And that distinction matters more than most people actually realize because anger just produces noise, but civil war requires withdrawal completely. Now, I know a lot of people, when you talk about civil war, the first thing that comes to their mind is January 6th. Events like January 6th loom large emotionally. They feel like proof that the edge has been reached. But structurally, they tell a different story. Because if you look at January 6th, there was low coordination, There was no institutional backing, no sustained command structure, no control of territory. Yes, it was destabilizing. Obviously, it was serious, but it wasn't revolutionary. And real revolutions don't look chaotic for long. They look long, boring, organized, and administrative actually once they begin. Every modern civil war shares one feature, and that's a fractured military. Now, if we're going to speak about the reality of the military in the US military is centralized, it's professionalized, and it's deeply invested in continuity. So it doesn't benefit from collapse, it doesn't gain from fracture, and it's structurally insulated from partisan takeover. So, without a military split, civil war is not just unlikely, it's functionally impossible for the United States. Anger without organized force becomes just a protest, not a war. So, that brings up the question, why does it feel like everything is so fragile right now? And this is where the real answer starts. Because what people are feeling is not collapse, it's erosion. Not of control, but of confidence. And not of order, but of trust. And erosion creates a specific psychological experience for people. Most people are angry, but they're not exiting the system. They're not withdrawing from the system at all. They're demanding more from it, even while distrusting it. And that creates a strange kind of tension. It's a high emotional energy, but a low structural rupture that feels unstable without being revolutionary. So, what actually happens in strained societies like this? When governments face prolonged strain, they usually don't fall, they just harden. Processes become slower, the rules become rougher, tighter, enforcement becomes more consistent, and discretion disappears. And if you think about the United States, you kind of see that already coming to fruition with a lot of things that's going on, especially with law enforcement, police, and ICE, and the military. The institutions grow colder, not weaker. And this actually just frustrates people even more. But what it does do is it preserves continuity in the system. The very things people complain about are the things preventing the collapse. And that's bureaucracy, courts, procedures, institutional inertia. They feel suffocating, they feel unresponsive, but they're stabilizing. They absorb the anger without breaking. So, what are people actually afraid of? Because most people are not truly afraid of war, they're afraid of something else. And that's the loss of their voice, the loss of their opinions, their mobility, their influence over outcomes. They feel like decisions are being made above them, around them, but without them. And that produces resentment, but not revolution. Human beings struggle with ambiguity. If things are bad, we can prepare. And if things are good, we can relax. But if things are constrained, tense, unresolved, there's no emotional script for that. So the mind reaches for dramatic language. And that's where you get civil war, collapse, the end of America. Not because those outcomes are realistically likely, but because they provide some sort of clarity for people. So that brings us to another question, naturally. And that question is, what is actually more likely to happen instead if it's not civil war like people are saying or feeling? And the more realistic trajectory is longer and slower, and that's political dysfunction, lower trust, higher enforcement, maybe military on the streets, more rules and fewer exceptions, regions drifting culturally and economically without formally breaking apart, government that feels more distant but still intact. So it's not an overthrow, but entrenchment. So connecting this back to the global shift that I talked about in earlier videos, this fits that larger pattern because what we're experiencing is a world that's moving from abundance to resilience, from flexibility to control, from expansion to containment. If that is happening globally, it would be strange if the US were immune. So, internal life reflects the external pressure that people feel. So, why does this feel worse than it is? Because as people, we measure stability by momentum, not by survival. You can endure hardship if you feel movement. What breaks people psychologically is feeling stagnant, like things aren't moving, working harder for the same outcome, arguing louder for the same result, voting repeatedly without feeling represented. That creates despair without collapse. Governments fall when they can't function anymore. Governments fall when they can't pay their workers, when they can't feed their cities, when they can't effectively enforce the law, when they can't move resources. And the United States can do all of those things. Not perfectly, maybe unevenly, but sufficiently. And that's enough to prevent a collapse. So, this thought process leads us to the answer that America is not on the brink of a civil war. It's just under a prolonged strain. And strain doesn't explode, it exhausts. It hardens systems, it narrows your options, and it makes life colder and more constrained. And that's unsettling, but it's not the same as falling apart. And understanding that difference might be the only thing keeping fear from turning into something worse.